Thank you, Ricard, so much for your wonderful presentation. And just a clarification, there's going to be a collective questions and answers with Ricard and Juliana after her presentation, so stick around. It's my pleasure to introduce Juliana Mulligan now. The title of her presentation is Ibogaine in the World, Treatment, Community Dynamics, and Indigenous Reciprocity. And I'm going to read her bio. Juliana Mulligan is the Psychedelic Program Coordinator at the Center for Optimal Living and has been an active member of the Ibogaine treatment community for 9 years. She holds a BA in psychology and is currently working on her Master in Social Work at NYU. She has worked in 3 Ibogaine clinics and completed Andrew Tartowski's IHRP training and has presented at multiple psychedelic and harm reduction conferences. She also founded and runs Inner Vision Ibogaine, in which she works therapeutically with people, supporting them in preparation for and in integration after Ibogaine treatment. She has developed a guide for finding safe Ibogaine treatment and is also currently working to create new systems of accountability and responsibility among Ibogaine practitioners through the Root Ibogaine Collective, which she co-founded. She has been featured and has written for Double Blind Magazine, Chacruna, Women's Day Magazine, and Symposia. Please welcome Juliana Mulligan.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Okay. I just want to start by acknowledging that we are standing here on occupied Lenape land. I also want to acknowledge that Ricard and I are speaking about an indigenous medicine that belongs to the Bwiti tradition and its practitioners. Their ancestral practices have laid the foundation for thousands of people to transform their relationship to substances and trauma. Without these generations of work from the practitioners of Bwiti, I might not be standing here alive today. I also just want to acknowledge and thank Ricard for his absolutely crucial work on the ICEER's Iboga Community Report. Thank you. I'm going to start off with a little bit about my personal story and how I came to work in Ibogaine treatment. After that, I'm going to dive into the current state of the Ibogaine treatment community and the needs we have for the future. I experienced a childhood of being severely bullied. I had no friends in elementary school in my conservative hometown. Kids were actively cruel to me, and I sat alone at lunch for multiple years because people thought I was weird. This social isolation caused me severe anxiety and depression. And after a tumultuous adolescence, at the age of 20, I discovered opioids. It was the first time I felt completely free from my anxiety and depression. It was an extremely effective medication for me at the time, but it came with a lot of damage to my already barely functional life, thanks to the criminalization of drugs and the people who use them. During the following 7 years, I experienced homelessness, getting beaten up, an overdose that put me into a 3-day coma that the doctors were surprised I woke up from, multiple rehabs, 12-step programs, methadone treatment, and months in county jail, which began with a cold turkey detox off of Suboxone. I spent 2 weeks in solitary confinement, and the correctional officers told me, "You aren't sick, it's all in your head. Suboxone doesn't have a withdrawal." I hadn't slept that whole time. But the most traumatic thing for me about being an opioid-dependent person in this society was being told that I have an incurable brain disease for life, and that the only way out was to admit that I'm powerless and that I had to accept full responsibility for the sick person they told me that I was. The disease model of addiction and the philosophies of the 12 steps are helpful for some, but for me they felt incredibly disempowering and re-traumatizing. The hyper-focus on individual responsibility contains little to no acknowledgement of the violent, patriarchal, white supremacist, and colonizing society that we live in. And it does little to acknowledge that we exist as a collective, and we do not each exist in a vacuum. Thanks to the ethos of modern society and capitalism, the original trauma for many of us who end up with destructive relationships to substances is that we were told since childhood that what we think and feel is wrong, and to just suck it up and keep working. So to push the agenda onto us once we ask for help, that we are powerless and don't know any better, furthers this violence of invalidation and furthers this original harm. At the end of my 7 years of using opioids, and after many failed attempts at leaving them behind, I was living in Bogota, Colombia. A hell of a place to try to stay away from drugs. I was living with my ex-partner at the time, and when he found out that I had been using fentanyl behind his back, he threw me out of our home, a young foreign woman who barely spoke Spanish, alone in Bogota, going through withdrawal. I detoxed in a hostel in downtown Bogota, a truly psychedelic experience in a dark kind of way. I had known about Ibogaine for a few years, but had never had the resources to go and do it. I didn't want my parents to know that I had relapsed again. But thankfully, a friend encouraged me to talk to my mom, and being the angel that she is, she immediately supported me unconditionally and offered to pay for my treatment. 3 days later, I was on a plane to Guatemala City to a clinic. The practitioners I had found seemed to be heartfelt guys on the phone. Little did I know, they were not following the clinical safety protocols that must accompany Ibogaine treatment. Because of the cardiotoxic side effects of Ibogaine, which includes something called a prolonged QT interval in which the space between the heartbeats is extended, it is non-negotiable that the safety clinical protocols are followed. Pre-treatment EKGs, heart monitoring during the treatment, and a stabilization period before dosing begins are a few of the elements of these protocols. The practitioner started dosing me 24 hours after my arrival, telling me I had the highest opioid tolerance they had ever worked with. I didn't know this till later, but the practitioner wasn't even weighing my doses. He was dosing intuitively. I also found out later that I had received double the amount of Ibogaine that is safe to give anybody, 40 milligrams per kilo. At a certain point during my treatment, my EKG was not looking good. They rushed me to 3 different hospitals, all of which turned us away. When we arrived at the 4th hospital, I hit the floor. I was having my first of 6 cardiac arrests. My heart had gone into the deadly arrhythmia torsades des points, which, if left untreated, leads to cardiac arrest. Because my heart would not stabilize on its own, I was put on an external pacemaker for 2 weeks in the ICU in Guatemala City. Fortunately, my heart went back to normal afterwards and has no damage. At that time, I didn't remember any of my visions from the Ibogaine experience. My first memory in the hospital was being completely bewildered that I wasn't in opioid withdrawal. After years of countless cold turkey withdrawals, that felt unreal. I also suddenly felt like a massive weight had been lifted off of me. All of the shame and guilt I had been carrying that society had imposed on me for my drug use was gone. I remember suddenly knowing that those 7 years of opioid use were actually my internship to do the work I was meant to do, working in Ibogaine treatment and working to change the oppressive addiction treatment system and the accompanying dehumanizing philosophies. I have not used an opioid since that moment of realizing my purpose and power 10 years ago. The gross mismanagement of my treatment greatly influenced the direction of my work in the Ibogaine community. I trained in 3 clinics, paying close attention to the safety details and cardiac aspects of treatment. After some time, I realized that one of the biggest missing pieces in Ibogaine treatment was the lack of continuing care for people after they went home. Just like other psychedelic medicines, Ibogaine is an amazing tool, but it is merely a door opener. The hardest work comes afterward. I eventually started working with individuals and their families before and after treatment, doing preparation and integration sessions based on the principles of harm reduction, to try and at least offer one piece of the support that people require post-treatment. Over these years working in the community, I witnessed and heard about countless abusive, dangerous, and unsafe practitioners, much like the ones who treated me. There are cases of sexual abuse, there are regular deaths, and an overall lack of properly trained mental health professionals working in clinics. Often women going to clinics are faced with mostly male staff with little to no trauma-informed training. This community is mostly unregulated and lacking in a centralized training structure. So there is no way to enforce the adherence to the clinical safety guidelines. Being that Ibogaine is often considered the strongest psychedelic medicine, it attracts people with the most severe trauma who have often tried everything else. Like myself, many of us become evangelical about Ibogaine after our life-changing experiences, and we want to immediately work in treatment. Often this means people are not taking the time to work through their own trauma or create healthier patterns for themselves, and many are not getting properly trained. This combination of factors creates the perfect conditions for abusive and narcissistic behavior to thrive. You can open a clinic in Mexico with a few grand, claim to be an expert, and charge thousands of dollars, all the while getting praised as a healer. As long as your website looks nice, there is no way for most people to determine if you are safe or properly trained. There is also another layer to this complex dynamic. A few years ago, I had an experience in which a highly regarded person in the Ibogaine community and a longtime friend of mine suddenly became very psychologically and verbally abusive when we started a romantic relationship. When I reached out to friends in the community who I thought for sure would support me, many minimized and disqualified my experience, saying it was not abuse because it wasn't physical. This was incredibly heartbreaking, but it helped me to realize that the violent methods of dehumanization and colonization present in our current society, some of which I experienced in the addiction treatment system, have been so deeply programmed within all of us that our language of relation with each other is sometimes tainted by tendencies of domination and control. It is so incredibly painful to recognize that we perpetuate this violence ourselves. Some people simply can't face it. The paradigm of punishment leaves people in fear of their own shadow. I'm relieved to finally see more and more recognition of physical and sexual violence, but the foundation of these behaviors is psychological violence. And if we don't hold each other accountable for our abusive behaviors because we don't think it qualifies as violence, then we are not going to uproot this extractive and dehumanizing system. We cannot build a safe space for vulnerable people to heal if our community has practitioners and heads of organizations who bully, threaten, and force their agendas on others. These accumulated experiences led me to co-found the women and queer-led Root Ibogaine Collective in order to work on the safety issues in the community and to support practitioners in taking better care of themselves. There are talented and safe people working with Ibogaine. Don't let my story scare you to death. And treatment can be done safely. I have witnessed and supported countless safe treatments. But out of 40 or so clinics in the world, I have 6 that I would ever feel safe sending anyone to. This must change. The sudden boom of investment in Ibogaine, with companies holding patents and intellectual property on certain protocols on an Ibogaine's metabolites, illustrates another aspect of violence. As Ricard was describing, many don't understand what true indigenous reciprocity is. One researcher said to me recently, "Well, we aren't using Ibogaine sourced from Iboga. It's coming from Voakonga now, so we don't need to talk about sustainability." She even told me it was a waste of time that someone had brought it up on her panel. Changing the source of plant material does help to give a highly depleted plant a chance to replenish, but it certainly doesn't cover all the bases of indigenous reciprocity. We must be consulting those in Gabon, respecting their wishes, and making sure their traditions and medicine are protected. Without this, taking this medicine and profiting off of it is just a perpetuation of colonization. This also applies to all of the Bwiti-style retreats across the Americas, which are run mostly by privileged white people. Something else I want to touch on is who is able to access Ibogaine treatment in this part of the world. Most of the people I see being able to afford Ibogaine are white men from the US and Europe. A small portion are women, and people of color are rarely seen at a clinic. Here we have an indigenous medicine being removed from its lands and used to help the most privileged people in the world, while those that are in the most need remain without access. This needs to change. Every clinic should be offering regular, low-cost, or free treatments, and some are, but not enough. My dream is to one day offer a training program for Ibogaine providers that offers not just safety protocol training, but trauma-informed training to work with women, trauma-informed training to work with people of color, and with regular therapy and mental health supervision being mandatory for all trainees and those that go to work on in clinics. My other dream is that the philosophies of harm reduction are adopted by all clinics so that people can feel supported in their own unique journey and power. I would love to never have to hear the dehumanizing word addict from a clinic ever again. To never have to explain again to an overwhelmed integration client that total abstinence is not the only definition of success. I want to see people feeling empowered in making their own goals because there is no one-size-fits-all treatment. Different things work for different people. And please, stop referring to this medicine as a cure, a solution, or an answer, because unlike what capitalism wants us to believe, there is no quick fix. Healing is a lifetime of work. Words like cure set people up for disappointment and failure. I've had many people ask me if something is wrong with them when the Ibogaine didn't offer the miracle that was promised to them. In this same spirit of gentleness and openness, I hope in the Ibogaine community and in the greater psychedelic community, we can start to hold each other accountable with love. Stop hiding from our shadows, because we cannot build a safe healing space on a foundation of denial and violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, both speakers. We'll start our panel, inviting everybody to make questions, and I'm going to make my own first question to both of you, and feel free to not comment if you don't want. Ricard, you said that in your bio, I read that you were initiated into the Gabon Iboga tradition. Can you share a little bit about why and how was it, if you want? And Juliana, can you also share a little bit about your personal experiences, if you feel that you want?
Hello. Well, why and how? Why I went to Gabon to do this assessment, understand what were the needs there. So I wanted to talk to the people there, and I'm not Gabonese and I'm not an African. And so I was told there that the first very step needed to be to get initiated, so I could go into knowing a little bit, opening that door to the spirit world and transitioning there. And so what happened? Well, from my own place, from where I come, which is South Europe, not Africa, I transitioned to that spirit world. But just in my own personal way, my cultural way of doing that. But it was one of the most amazing, deep experiences that I've had. After that, I had to recover a little bit, and then I was able to go and speak to all of them very humbly. And maybe the interesting thing there is that in the beginning when I went there, I thought that it was not a good idea to get initiated before doing the job. I thought that I could be like maybe in another place, which I was, but it couldn't have been any other way, because the elders and the people there wouldn't have talked to me if I wouldn't have done this in that way. That's what they were telling me, so I'm very grateful that I followed the good advice.
Very well, so we can learn something about scientific objectivity. It's all the contrary. Personal experience and direct engagement seem to be crucial from traditional standpoints. I know you have ears, I don't know what you can share, but...
Yeah, I haven't been initiated yet in Gabon, but I have been there and I've watched ceremonies in 3 different villages. In my personal experience, like I said, I actually didn't remember anything. I remembered a snippet of visions about 3 months later, but for me, it was okay because I felt the transformation when I woke up in the hospital. Like, I felt like a completely different person. I felt like a little kid again, and inspired and excited about life and connected to a purpose. So that's what was important to me. I microdose with Iboga currently, sustainably grown Iboga, let me say that. And it's extremely helpful for me. It makes me feel very present and very in tune with my inner self, and so that's wonderful. It's a huge gift in my life. But I look forward to doing the initiation because I want to understand the tradition where this comes from. It's incredibly important to me.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions. I'm going to take 2 questions at once, so you each can answer which question you feel like it, and let's just try to give more opportunity to people. So can you... Yeah, you first.
Hi, my name is Corinne. I'm a psychiatry resident. I'm curious your thoughts about transitioning people to Suboxone or methadone alongside Ibogaine treatment.
So, unfortunately...
Juliana, can just, we have more questions first.
Yes. My name is Aaron. I'm the founder of the Autistic Psychedelic Community. We have a lot of our community members. I understand. We have a lot of our community members seeking services, and you mentioned 6 out of the 40 centers of passing a test in that way. I'm curious if you have a recommendation for those as far as doing their own self-vetting or recommended starting points for those seeking services. Thank you.
Did you understand?
Yeah.
Some of us are not native speakers like him and I. Can people make the question without the mask? Because
I didn't understand with the mask, but I'm not a native speaker, but she did, and I think it's for you.
Can I go?
yes.
So for the Suboxone and methadone question, unfortunately, you cannot do Ibogaine directly from Suboxone and methadone because it leaves your system very slowly, Ibogaine or not. So if someone does an Ibogaine treatment right after Suboxone or methadone, they will still be incredibly sick for months, unfortunately. The only exception to this is a low-dose protocol pioneered by Claire Wilkins of Pangea Biomedics, which is not one big dose. It's small doses daily for 2 to 5 weeks. You can go directly to that treatment from Suboxone and methadone, but she works with 1 person at a time, so there's a long wait list. The other thing that most people do is they switch back to a short-acting opioid for 6 weeks before doing Ibogaine, which is tricky because the only thing available on the street in the United States is fentanyl now, for the most part. So it's a bit dangerous. So we're in a complicated position thanks to Suboxone and methadone. I wish that we had heroin maintenance like they do in Europe. It would make things a lot easier, but we don't. So yeah. And to the other question about finding clinics, I developed a guide for finding a safe clinic. It's on my website, innervisionibogaine.com. If you ask a clinic all those questions, you can pretty much weed out the unsafe people, but also feel free to email me if you have a question about a certain clinic. I pretty much know the lay of the land.
Can we have 2 more?
Hi, Juliana. Are there any clinics here in New York City? Any options for Ibogaine here in New York City? And if not, why not? And how can we change that?
Yeah, good question. No, Ibogaine is a Schedule I substance still, and there are underground providers working in the US, but it's really difficult to make underground treatment in the US safe because you need heart monitoring and a medical staff. So while there are a few people that have managed to do it safely, for the most part, I don't recommend trying to do it within the US. I would go to one of the clinics in Mexico to have it done right and to be properly monitored.
Hi, in relation to what you said about these indigenous ceremonies being the first psychedelic therapy sessions, how do you think we can start including indigenous people in legalization conversations? Yeah.
How to include indigenous people in legalization conversations? Well, that's a very big question, because in some, for instance, in Gabon, it's legal Iboga, as in Peru is legal ayahuasca. So if we are talking about the legalization of the medicines out of their countries, that is a conversation that might be complicated sometimes and not so obvious, and some of them might not agree with all the implications of legalizing this. So we are now, Miriam Volat is going to talk this afternoon in another talk here, and from the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund, we are also working now in including these voices in solutions on the different medicines. But it is, I have to say that in our conversations, they are in all the levels of government in this institution, but in our conversation, it's not so obvious how should be legalized things out of their countries. So if we are speaking about simple and sheer decriminalization and not of a regulation following certain rules, instructions, and maybe systems of access and benefit sharing, as we were saying, I mean, it's not only legal or illegal, the question here. We need to deep into what regulation and what it means and what are the implications. But yes, of course, they need to be in all these conversations, and we need not only in these conversations of legal stuff, but in all the other conversations that we are having in this kind of spaces, psychedelic spaces. Yes.
Yeah, I want to add something that when the first city that decriminalized peyote was Oakland in 2019, and as Oakland moved and launched this initiative, the Native American Church has expressed distress that wasn't consulted and invited to sit on conversations. And instead of the leaders of the movement just humbly acknowledging that they weren't invited and inviting them into conversations, they went on a whole crusade against the Native American Church, which I think is really bad karma. You know, this has been an ongoing problem in the psychedelic community in the US to exclude Native American perspectives, and the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative, that is an institution that unites 4 of the major institutions that represent all Native Americans in the United States, plus other allies, have written a letter to the psychedelic community inviting them to take into account Native perspectives. And Miriam Volat from River Styx is going to speak in this afternoon about these issues. And it's really shocking that the psychedelic community has rejected the appeals of Native Americans to have sovereignty over the regulation, including cultivation, and their rights to vote and advocate over the future of this medicine that is so fragile and that is going each time harder and harder to find in the land. So we have a whole example of how not to do things, and I'm glad that this conference is bringing this issue up, and invite everybody to continue in the afternoon this part of the conversation.
Question is for Richard. Do you believe in the current Western psychotherapeutic model with psychedelics? And I'll add to that and say, without more emphasis on the plants and the context, do you think
Can you
we're
repeat?
setting...
Sorry, we couldn't understand you. So can you repeat more clear, like
Sure.
for him?
Do you think that we're setting people up with the healing through psychedelics to reintroduce them into capitalism? Because there isn't the set and setting to connect folks with the plants.
I think I got your question. Well, I think that psychedelics, we said it before, and there's not a magic pill here. And it's something that can open a door, but we have a greater problem here, which is related to our cosmovision. to the way in which we are in this world, the way in which we believe the world is. So bringing these medicines into the global north, it's not a magic pill that will solve our problems in the global north. So we really need to, but it's a very good opportunity to allow us opening some sort of let's say, blocked visions that we have. But I don't think it will solve our problems just like this, no. But I think it's one of the best chances we have at this point. But we need to really revise the way in which we believe our relationship, our connection with life, with the world is. That's what I believe. But it is just my personal opinion.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the speakers.